Hi everyone, this will be our video for our week 8 video, The Great Buddha Plus. This film came out in 2017. It's by a pretty young director named Huang Yao, who I actually don't know very much about. The film won all sorts of awards in Taiwan. It was actually Taiwan's entry as Best Foreign Film for the 2018 Academy Awards. It ended up not being nominated, but it's very well thought of. The director says that it's inspired, he says, it's inspired by my grievances toward Taiwanese society. And so the topic is hopefully kind of indicated by this picture here. It's about this real gap between the rich and the poor that this director and many others see growing in Taiwan over the last several years. It's about the people that Marx would have called the lumpen proletariat, the dispossessed, the disenfranchised, the uprooted, the people who don't really understand that they're part of this larger dispossessed class. And so we'll see people, these kind of middle-aged men who have, by the standards of society and what one may be supposed to achieve, they've achieved nothing. They would be considered like the losers of society. Guys like Belly Button, Pickle, Sweet Apple, and the people they work for, the political elites, cultural elites, economic elites that they work for in rural Taiwan. So it's a real farce. It's, I mentioned during class that it's really, really vulgar. It's really crude in many ways. The language is very crude in many ways. There's some pretty crude sexual scenes. There's some violence. To be frank, it pushes the bounds of the kinds of films that I'm comfortable showing, but it's really good. And so for that reason, I decided to show it, even though some of that stuff's not my favorite. It's really sarcastic. It's really witty. It's very dark in its humor, and it's dark and witty in the ways that it kind of pokes fun at some of these men of the really poorest men in Taiwanese society, but in the end they're not really the butt of the joke. He kind of has some fun with these guys, but as the story goes on, you'll see that the real target are these elites and the way they push around these people below them, and the hypocrisy of these people. Much of it is set in this you see a company with a gate in front, and then so Pickle is the night watchman, and he kind of looks over the factory, and the company is called something like the Globe Cultural Creation Company or something along those lines. And we'll see them making big Buddha statues. And so again, using our logic of kind of the directors have things happening that they want us to think about. There's definitely no coincidence that this is a cultural creation factory making these religious objects. But the people involved are corrupt and worse. This gap between rich and poor is growing. It's something that's real. It's something that's a real concern in Taiwan. On the other hand, it's still a much smaller gap than is the average around the world. If you may know about the coefficient, the calculation that's used to describe and calculate that gap between the wealthy and the poor in a society, the Gini coefficient, G-I-N-I, Gini coefficient. Taiwan's Gini coefficient is quite a bit lower than the world average. They're around the level of Canada and Japan in terms of the gap between rich and poor. The US, on the other hand, is quite a bit bigger of a gap between rich and poor than is the world average. The US is between Malaysia and Argentina in that category. So it's both, in one of the readings we had recently, it talked about the economic miracle in Taiwan and how one of the successes had been this narrow gap between rich and poor. And even though the film, some of the films we've seen have concentrated on that gap, it is also true that it's a smaller gap than we're used to here in the US. But it's still obviously something that's growing and something that's a real concern. And I think that's the real soul of this movie, is that it takes that very seriously, and thinks about the implications of that gap. And it has a lot of crude jokes all the way through, and kind of has some fun with these guys. Again, in my background, I see Sweet Apple and Pickle are these two guys. And so we'll see jokes about their kind of maybe some lack of intelligence, but also what's interesting is the way that they act towards people that are kind of above them in society, whether it's the police or their bosses, and then the way they talk to each other. The readings that are associated with this film for this week are 2 chapters from the book called Democracy on Trial by an author named Chuang. This book came out in about 2014 or so. And I think it's a book on local democracy. And so it's not exactly about the kinds of issues that are precisely in this film, but it's definitely about democracy at this local level. And so I picked it because one of the characters in this film is this local politician. And from the very beginning of the film, we see that he's vain, he's corrupt, he's dishonest. But that's part of the farce of this film, is to take these kind of corrupt politicians, hypocritical, artists and businessmen, and kind of expand that out and see, what would happen if these people were truly that corrupt and truly that hypocritical. But the book is not about that kind of farcical stuff. It's more about just the fact of how local democratic activism developed in the 90s and the 2000s. Local activism, local politics, the importance of the local in Taiwanese politics. Just the category itself is actually really important, because if you think about it and everything we've been talking about, to concentrate on the local in Taiwan and to say the issues in this town, the issues in this county, is actually quite a loaded thing to say, especially in the 80s, even into the 90s, when you consider the KMT's focus on getting back to China, using 75, 80, 85% of the government's resources to put into the military to try to get back to China someday. By the 90s, that dream is over. And that's when democracy is really opening up. But again, my point here is just to say that to talk about the local is in itself a pretty significant move in Taiwanese politics. That includes environmental movements against different kinds of factories, the DuPont factory that was going to open up, the government's own record of poor regulation of nuclear plants, for example, organization against another nuclear plant that was going to be built, the 4th one in Taiwan. And so, again, those readings are meant to relate to this part of the story. Again, that local part of it and how local democracy actually developed in this pretty productive way, even though, several years later in 2017, we see this film that still finds room to point out the problems and the real serious problems with it. So again, I think that this will be a nice change from the films we've been watching recently. I think you'll find it really funny, but you might also find it gross, crude. Some of the things we see are gross. Some of the language these men use is gross. But I think it feels like a very real kind of film. So I think it's pretty useful for this class. So I hope you enjoy it. And I'll be showing it Friday afternoon, and I'll hope to see you there, and then I'll see you on Monday.